With 15 days to go until the presidential election of 2024, we are here to engage with students and teachers on the 13th episode of the Constitution of American Life with the Friends of Publius. Before we get to an insightful discussion on religious liberty, we have a couple of announcements we need to make, and then, of course, our question of the day. First, if you aren't aware, we would like to guide you to PBS on Tuesday nights, or you can watch on YouTube, to the documentary on the We the People, the Citizen, and the Constitution program titled Citizen Nation. The program follows students, teachers, and classes through the 2023-24 academic year, culminating in the national finals last April in Virginia, Washington, D.C. Secondly, given the seriousness of this election season and the challenges facing humanity throughout the world, we have decided to present two bonus programs this fall-winter. First, since both candidates claim that if the opposition is elected, it will lead to the downfall of America's constitutional democracy, we would like to share our thoughts on the Constitution and the election of 2024. Secondly, given the constant emphasis on what the framers intended, thought, or would think, we would like you to join us for a discussion on a wonderful book that all of the FOPs have read. It is called The Nation That Never Was. It was authored by Kermit Roosevelt III, professor of law at the University of Penn. And it makes a very interesting argument that not all the friends here necessarily agree with, but it does spark intense discussion about what founding, the first, second, third founding, should we be focused on here when we talk about the founding. And so that program is planned hopefully for December. The program on the election, the Constitution and the election, is planned for late October. And so we hope that you guys will enjoy those conversations, as well as the remaining conversations we have on the unit questions for the state finals 2024-25. So our question of the day for students and teachers to discuss in their class or in their units or at home with family is this: should public school teachers be allowed to lead students in religious prayers during extracurricular and co-curricular programs such as sports, music, theater, and academic events? Explain your position and have a good conversation. Hopefully what we talk about here in this episode will maybe give you some framework in which to develop your own position on that. So given our announcements here, we're going to forego our This Day in History segment and turn to our discussion on the First Amendment, religious clauses, and the tension of our religious history within our godless Constitution. So as is our tradition, let's first turn, and I know I see the look on the faces. Time is always a factor here.
I love the minor, moderate, major. What, David?
Well, to be quite honest, there wasn't much that happened on this day in history. I would have had to stretch it there, so I decided that
100th anniversary of Rhapsody in Blue.
Okay,
yes. 100th anniversary this week.
I knew, yes, that's true. I did see a segment on that. So as is our tradition, let's turn to our 18th century with Professor Tim Moore to talk about the religious clauses in the First Amendment. So Tim, in one of the most recent decisions in Kennedy versus Bremerton, which was decided in 2022, there was a disagreement between those in the majority and those in the dissent on whether or not the two religious clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Freedom of Exercise Clause or Free Exercise Clause, whether or not they conflict with each other or that there's tension between those two clauses. So what I'm wondering is, as they were working towards, all right, this statement of the role of religion in civil society and the role of government in our society, in the new nation that they're creating, were the founders, framers aware of this tension between an individual's free exercise and the desire to not have a national church or religion?
Yeah, I think they were aware of this tension, and I think the history bears that out, even back into the colonial era. I mean, I've often wondered whether it would have been better for the First Amendment to say Congress shall make no law interfering with the freedom of religion. Leave it even more vague. Because at the founding there's a lot of discussion about what the freedom of religion means. Uh, and I know that some people currently would like those two, it seems to me their approach equals freedom of religion, and these are saying the same thing, different sides of the same coin. And the coin is freedom of religion. Well, okay, but the problem is, I'm honestly, I think if the First Amendment would have said freedom of religion rather than the two clauses, I think we'd have got to this problem, establishment versus free exercise. I don't think that it would have taken long after the 14th Amendment to get there, but I do think it was there. And I guess view, my personal view is that establishment is uh, how you're defining establishment. And actually, I think one of the really great sections in the We the People book does, I think, a fantastic job laying out three different flavors of establishment. You can establish, there's this theory that you're not established. Congress can do whatever it wants. It can spend money however it wants. It can favor certain religions. It can do whatever it wants, but it can't make a law that says we're officially Christian, or it's kind of this. I think the book might call it literal. Congress can do whatever it wants, just so long as you don't make a law. Then there's this other version that says, well, I kind of call it the strict separationist. And there were a few founders that were strict separationists, Jefferson and Madison, most notably. I think they're in a minority at the founding. And that view is simply that religion and government, government should really stay miles and miles away from anything that smacks of favoring or interacting with religion. And I think there's this moderate view that kind of says, well, government can interact with all religions equitably. They just can't, I think sometimes it's called non-preferentialism. You can't prefer one over the other. So I guess in practical policy, if we're going to have faith-based initiatives for drug treatment, money, you're not establishing a religion if you spend the pot of money equitably across all religions. You're not establishing one over the other. There's a non-preference. So to me, I think, and maybe students, I would recommend in all of your discussions you're going to have about this question, I'd sort out which flavor of establishment that you kind of want to camp out on, because I think your view of establishment and how it's been viewed and operated kind of will drive, you're going to be asked these questions like, what about in your hearings? Well, I would couch your answer in your particular view of establishment. I think now to the founders, I think establishment comes up in money. There's this famous fight in Virginia in the 1780s. Patrick Henry wants an assessment, tax assessment to be distributed amongst Christian denominations. And Madison most famously writes a great bullet point, a rebuttal to it. It's called Memorial and Remonstrance. And so it's interesting to me, establishment comes up very early over money. Now it comes up earlier in the colonial period as well as money.
Well, in all fairness, it's beyond money.
Oh, sure. There are
It
oaths.
is about
I mean, at the
conscience.
founding period, oaths are another issue of establishment. Can you force people to take an oath? That was seen as a religious thing, not necessarily just I promise to. So religious oaths were another one of those early flashpoints of whether we're establishing a religion by making people, swear that they believe in a Trinity or they believe in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Some states didn't want clergy to be elected politicians, so they're very strict separationists. Uh, in fact, there was a couple of ratification conventions that got grumbly with pastors being in the ratification convention as delegates. So there's always, I mean, the early Congress passes laws supporting chaplains, and the Northwest Ordinance, there was a provision for chaplains. Um, I've got a whole list of things here. The officers had to be religious. I think in 1806, officers had to have religious training. So Congress does all kinds of stuff, kind of couched within the framework of in that case, I think it's like flavor um, number one, you can do whatever you want just as long as you don't officially declare it. So the early history seems to me it's flavor number one of establishment and a lot of flavor number two, where it was equitable treatment of the various denominations. Now, the question, it's always about Christianity versus other religions too. And so it's gone through an evolution of disestablishment within the Christian denominations and then disestablishment in terms of Christianity and other religions, or just no religion. And that's where the freedom of conscience is different than freedom of religion. So I think there's a lot of evidence in the founding period that you can make an argument in three different views of establishment are in play. There's nothing definitive, at least the way I read the history about the founding period.
Just real quickly, it seems to me, isn't the trend, however, all right? I mean, there's a trend here. One, you've got Locke's work on toleration. You've
Yep.
got Roger Williams' work in Rhode Island. That the disestablishment trend, to me, seems to be gaining energy by the time we get to the 1780s. Because you
I would,
said Jefferson and Madison are in this minority.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it seems to me that if we look at the language of the Constitution, not the Bill of Rights, but the Constitution,
yeah.
that seems to reinforce a Lockean notion of, hey,
Right.
we don't want our Constitution. The state
Well,
Constitution is one thing, but the
you're
national
right. I mean,
Constitution,
there's the national story and there's a state story.
right. And so to me, we're talking about the national story. All right.
Well, but we all know that the national constitution, in terms of rights, doesn't mean much till the 14th Amendment. So I think it's fair to isolate the founding period between a national story, which there isn't much there. There is a trend toward disestablishment, but nobody wants to go out as far on a limb as Jefferson and Madison. And although there's an interesting Baptist pastor, this was fascinating to me. His name was John Leland. He's a Baptist pastor. He is as radical as Jefferson and Madison. He wrote this wonderful, wonderful, really long essay that I think is much better than Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance. And here you have a deeply religious person, John Leland, arguing for very strict separation.
And
And I think
and
it's not,
the context.
well, absolutely. He's a Baptist and he's getting the living crap beat out of him. Baptists all over Virginia getting beat up. But not just in Virginia too. So
Right.
I'm going to push back a little bit. There is a state story that I think is very relevant, not just the national story.
But under our constitutional, I don't doubt that it's relevant, but under our constitutional system of federalism, all
Mhm.
right, divided powers and stuff, they're going to leave that through the language that they choose. And in the original Constitution, the only mention, all right, of religion is Article 6 and
Sure.
no religious clauses. But they're going to make it very clear that the one story and the national story, and the reason I mention this, Tim, is we're going to get to it somewhere in the discussion, is where we are contemporarily. And in a
Well,
contemporary
that's a
setting,
whole different animal.
well, I
But
know, but it's a whole different animal. But those who are arguing that and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but I just want to provide the framework. Those who are arguing that we are a Christian nation don't differentiate between the national and the state. They
well,
put them
right,
together.
and that's just right. That's bad history.
Okay, thank
Very
you.
bad history.
All right.
But I guess my point is, if you want to talk about a national story, I'm just saying the first Congress does all kinds of odd stuff that we would look from a strict separationist view today. We would go, well, what the hell, or what the heck? So I guess even at the
Tim, the
national,
norm has changed. Once the candidate from one party starts throwing four-letter words out during the campaign, I think we're all safe now. All right.
Okay. So even the national story, I think uh, there's a lot of, I mean, I don't want to use the word offend our modern sensibilities, but there's a national story that we would look at and go, how did they do that? If there's this First Amendment no establishment thing, well, they're defining establishment differently at the founding, at the national level. Now, they're certainly doing it at the state level as well.
Okay, so go ahead, Chris.
Well, just one, I think I know that there was, I think, I'm pretty sure there was a provision in the Northwest Ordinance also for religious freedom, right?
Yeah.
Religious toleration.
Yeah.
And also, though, I'm trying to remember, I was going to reach behind me and try and find the book, but I'd have to dig around for a little bit. I know that was it in New Hampshire? There was in the Vermont, then eventually Vermont, there was a strong disestablishment movement
Yep.
up there,
Yep.
whether it be the Green Mountain Boys and some of those folks up there. So, but also at the state level, it was interwoven, I think,
Mhm.
in terms of religion and government.
Well, Tim's brought in, I want to transition here, and that is to make clear to students that both clauses of the First Amendment are about religious liberty, right? I mean, that the two components are necessary to create a free state, all right, based upon conscious or religious faith there. And I find, and I like to talk, but I'd like to talk about the Establishment Clause, Chris, because I think that's where a lot of the controversy is throughout our legal history. And first of all, it's interesting because Tim said if they had just said this, but I look at the Establishment Clause because they don't say Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. They say Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Does that what does that imply by throwing in that word respecting an establishment? Because the one tool that you talk about, hey, they just can't establish a national church or a national religion, all right, seems to not be covered by this. This phrase seems to go beyond that. So one, Chris, if you can talk a little bit about does throwing the word respecting into that phrase, what implication, if any, does it have? But also, how is the Establishment Clause intended to protect religious liberty of individuals? All right. We know the
Um,
Free Exercise Clause, that one's simple, but how does the Establishment Clause attempt to do that?
well, I think, I, what was the name of the Baptist minister who wrote the essay, Timothy?
John Leland.
I would think that they would say that you're keeping government out of religion, therefore keeping it free. Because if government has a way to dictate, then once there's a corrupting influence of government on religion. And I think that was a fear of like not just religion creeping into government, but government creeping into religion. And I'm not familiar with Leland's essay, but I would venture a guess he probably writes about that a lot because I know Madison talks about
Yeah.
that as well. The idea that a religion should be able to stand on its own without support of government. Of course, he's alluding to taxes being paid in Virginia and the Baptists being persecuted as well. I'm going to quote, this is more of a paraphrase of a late scholar in our network, Kermit Hall, who I think most of us had the pleasure or the duress of being grilled by Kermit. No one knows what the hell they meant by the Establishment Clause. Free exercise, yeah, David, you're right. We get it, but when they talk respecting an establishment of religion, it's hard to know exactly because honestly, the first Congress taking Madison's proposals in his original proposals for his Bill of Rights, and they're mashing together what he has into the First Amendment. And so, when you have a group project like that with editing being done, it's hard to know exactly what they meant by that then. And it's probably not as important what they meant by it then because it doesn't really pertain to us now. So when they say Congress shall make no law, we know that these rights, most of these rights in the Bill of Rights are negative rights because they're limiting what Congress can do. So I think they're trying, and again, think what they're trying to do is keep the government from favoring one religion over another. I mean, it's pretty much that simple. And if the government cannot favor one religion over another, then these maybe more what might have been considered in the 1780s, 1790s, and early 1800s as fringe faiths. They have a better niche carved out for them because the government is not coming in necessarily. The national government is not coming in and dictating. Therefore, it allows you a greater free exercise because you're not allowed. The government's not allowed to prohibit the free exercise as well. But again, and I stress this nationally, because we know that the states, you have state-sponsored religions, you have official religions in many of the states, which causes some of the early strife. So what does it mean in 1791 when it's ratified? I don't know. I mean, no one really, I don't think anybody's really clear on what it meant then, but it really didn't matter until we get to the 14th Amendment anyway. Because when we start to see the incorporation of the protections of the First Amendment therein, creates kind of where we are in our modern kerfuffle over the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, gentlemen, I'm having, I think, some internet issues. I don't know if you're noticing it. You guys can hear me right now?
Yes.
Okay, just in case you lose me, you know what to do here. But, well, would you agree with me, Chris, that inserting respecting into the language does imply a broader meaning than just Congress creating a religion? Would you agree with me on that?
Well, could they have used different language? Could they said Congress will make no law favoring one religion over another? Yeah, that would have made it pretty clear. But they're using language from the 1790s. I mean, it's very difficult to put on our 2024 goggles and look backwards and understand exactly what they meant by that, especially when the work's being done in Congress in committee, right? To take Madison's original proposals and mash them together into what we know is the First Amendment.
I know that I know that there are some scholars that make a big deal about respecting Anne. I don't get it. I honestly don't get it. And I think my opinion is based upon, I think they're reading into respecting Anne, they're reading in strict separation. That respecting Anne somehow equals what they meant was strict separation. Well, I mean, I look at the historical record and I just don't see, other than the occasional Madison, Jefferson, and Leland and others, but most people are not strict separationists. So I just kind of think I don't understand the argument that equals strict separation. I mean, I just look at it as like in regards to.
Well, we know that people put so much emphasis on, Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists about the wall of separation.
Yeah.
But he's writing to Baptists, and so he's, Jefferson maybe being Jefferson on that. But I do believe that, and what I said earlier is, I think there's probably more of a worry of religions and being corrupted by government, and not so much religion corrupting government.
Mike?
Yeah, I have a question, and if we're going to touch on this later, then just pass it. I'm super interested in this national state divide because it feels like the founders knew that the state was where the action was going to take place. So I'm wondering, and Tim, I'm looking at you, but Chris, you may know this as well. Of the state constitutions that are in effect in the, I guess, 80s and 90s, are there state constitutions that have the equivalent of a establishment clause? Like, is that the majority of the, like, I'm thinking about, is that the majority or is that in the minority? Are most states?
Eight had religious test oaths.
Okay.
Many of I don't know the exact number, but many, there was tax support for particular denominations. So yeah, I mean, to our sensibilities, that's not disestablishment.
Right.
Well, and we got to remember that, at least from some people's point of view, I think it is Tim's favorite, Professor Amar's argument that the Bill of Rights is in many ways a federalism argument. They're worried about the national government, which the first line, Congress shall not. Whether or not they seriously should have been, because we know that Madison is reticent about this Bill of Rights unless it does apply freedom of conscience to the state governments, because he is very aware that it's where the state governments or it's in the states that a lot of these violations are going to occur, and that debate is happening. But in some ways, Mike, this prohibition against Congress is somewhat, and the history plays out. It makes us feel good, but in the matter of law, it's just not going to play that much. I mean, heck, the first decision involving religious freedom at a federal court level, that's until the 1880s. Am I correct there, Chris? It's the Utah case.
Well, yeah, which I was going to touch on later when we get a little further down the road, because I can see someone bringing that up. It was Reynolds, right? The Reynolds case out of Utah and polygamy.
Right.
So,
yeah,
hey.
and we'll talk about that, but just to understand is some of this Bill of Rights. And remember, and Madison makes it clear that these Bill of Rights have no meaning unless they protect you against the state governments. But he loses that debate. We get a Bill of Rights, and I think we could argue that those Bill of Rights for the first 100 years, we get not, I don't even know if we get a full hand of digits of Bill of Rights cases. We get Barron, we get Dred Scott. Anything else, gentlemen, that deal with bills of rights in federal courts?
Unless there's some original jurisdiction cases, but those aren't Bill of Rights cases. So, honestly, if you think about it, David, you alluded to it's Barron v. Baltimore that seals the deal on that. It's Marshall's and his court's interpretation of the Bill of Rights only protecting you from the national, not the state. And to reinforce what you're saying about Madison, I mean, we know that at the convention, Madison tried to get a national veto over state laws, did not work. He tried to get it into his original proposals on the amendments to the Constitution. As you said, David, that got shot down. And, he understood this is where the mischief happened. But again, we're coming out of a confederation, and people are going to want to make sure their sovereignty at the state level is protected.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, I understand Tim's reticence about this respecting language being a tool of strict separation, and I think that is partly what it's doing, because we have to understand that there is a historical context here. Those people in the American colonies and states, all right, are the refugees from predominantly Europe. And they are fleeing in many cases in the 17th and 18th century. They're fleeing religious conflict. They're fleeing religious wars, all right, that are going on the continent and in England in almost the entire 17th century. And it's not just about what is the official religion. There are shadows of that establishment, Tim. And there are other laws and other codes of behavior that localities and states are implementing that infringe upon religious liberty, that don't rise to the level of establishing a national religion. And I think at least Madison, Jefferson, and they were very conscious of that. And so, yes, they were strict separatists in many ways. They're a minority, but they do write the amendment.
Well,
it's ratified, and that's what's amazing is those who ratified, what did they think it meant?
We also have to be
in Congress. Everybody thought they were safe because their states, there was no prohibition on the states.
Right.
We also have to be clear too with those early settlers too. I mean, we talk about people coming here for religious liberty. Well, they're coming here for their religious liberty, right?
Yeah.
Not your religious liberty, because if you want to practice your religious
liberty,
unless
you're Pennsylvania,
then you got to move, right? Then you got to move because it ain't gonna fly here. So this whole idea of religious liberty is for my religious liberty, not your religious liberty.
So, Professor Williams, one of the leading cases. So we get into the 20th century, and because of the 14th Amendment, it takes a while. The First Amendment religious clauses are going to be incorporated into the state constitutions and the state governments. And one of, I think, the major cases, all right, that's in the 70s, is Wisconsin versus Yoder. Dear and near to the heart of Professor Moore there. And critics have argued that the decision, it dealt with the Amish tribe, Amish Christian community there, that the court carves out an exception for the Amish to not follow state law and send their kids to school until age 14. So they rule on religious liberty, the free exercise, that the state mandating that they go to school to 14 would be infringing upon the religious tradition and exercise of the Amish. Critics have said by doing so, they're playing around with the Establishment Clause because now the state of Wisconsin is favoring the Amish because they're not giving the same exemption to other religions. What do you think about that? What is your take as far as the conflict? Is that a true conflict between the two clauses?
I think it is. I think it is showing the conflict, and you frame this as a leading case, which is interesting. I think it's an exceptional case, meaning it's a unique case. I remember in law school, this was a case that got a lot of discussion, right? It was because it was super interesting and it's super interesting because it kind of stands alone where the court in this 7-0 decision, as you said, there was what's called a general applicable law, like everyone in the state has to go to school until you're 16. And the Amish asked for an exception and the court ruled 7-0. Douglas dissented in the reasoning of the court, but he went along with the decision, right? Part of his dissent is what you were getting at, saying, well, this court is given a lot of the opinion said, well, the Amish are such nice and good people, and they've been marginalized, and they're law-abiding, and this is not gonna, the state is not gonna, there's not gonna be any bad
Not
things.
going to break the budget.
Right. And Douglas kind of says in his dissent, like, what about all the other religious groups? I mean, why are we saying like we're carving out this exception? Now, my understanding is that now, for example, this case is often cited in briefings, right, to say like for homeschoolers or for other exceptions to be made. The closest the court got to thinking about Yoder again, and what I've seen is the Smith case in 1990, right, where a group of folks said they wanted to smoke peyote. It was part of their religious ceremony. The state of Washington said, no, we have a general applicable law against drug use. And the court in that decision distinguished Yoder, did not overturn it, but said, no, in this case, you can't do it because the state has a real interest in drugs, on drugs, which then led to Congress acting and passing the Religious Freedom Act, RFRA Act, right? So it had this kind of knock-on effect. So this case is kind of out there. I think it's important. I think rhetorically, it has not been important in terms of the court citing it and using it for similar types of cases, because I think what you led with, which I'm going to get to, is I think, yeah, this wasn't like Wisconsin said from now on, the Amish religion is the state religion of Wisconsin, but did they privilege, to use Tim's, I think, nice 3-bucket sort of categorization from the text? Is the state sort of favoring the Amish in a way that other groups weren't? And does that kind of maybe make it feel like there's an establishment issue? Maybe there is an establishment issue. I think so. And I think that this case demonstrates that tension. And I know we're going to talk about the other cases coming up in this vein. They're a little different because they're not general applicable laws, but yeah, there's definitely a tension there. And I think this case was decided in a way that, again, I don't know of any other case that was decided in a way where a group was made this sort of exception for them.
Well, I like the way you said it because you debate, or not debate, you disagree marginally on whether it's a leading case. You say it's an exceptional. But given the direction the court has gone in the last maybe 15 years, to me, it's a leading case because it is referenced. And
Yes.
now in the 21st century, the exceptions that are being carved out,
Yes.
all right,
Yeah.
and the establishment side of all this, all right, if we can look at a football coach, leading prayers while he is still on duty, All right, we're looking at public monies going to private schools. We're looking at Bibles now being required and the Bible being required to be taught in public school. All of these, to me, eventually go back to this exceptional or leading decision in Wisconsin. Would you agree?
I would agree there's a through line there. I guess what I would have the students think about is in these cases making these exceptions, my reading is the court is using they're trying to analyze it differently. They're not saying, oh, we're doing this just because of Yoder. They're making the argument to get to the result in Yoder, but they're just not using it as a precedent and just saying, because of Yoder, we're doing this. They're doing something a little trickier. I think the students, as you're looking through these more recent cases, just look and pay attention to how Yoder is being framed in those decisions. I guess that's my point.
And that's fair. That's good. Yeah, Chris.
Well, I think there's another case too from 1947. That's what I wanted to check. Everson, the Everson case, right?
Yeah.
Versus the Board of Education, 1947. It was an Establishment Clause case about reimbursement for busing. And I don't want to get too knee deep in the weeds on that, but if you look at the dissents in that opinion, there was maybe it was a 5-4 decision. I have to check that, but you look at the reasoning in the dissent, and you see that coming forward into you see it coming forward in the dissent in the case mentioned in this question, Locke v. Davey, right? The dissenting opinion in Locke was it was Justice Thomas and Justice Alito.
Mhm.
And so you see that kind of that through line in a couple of those dissents. And as you're kind of getting at there, David, I think there's if we're talking about this balance between these two clauses, that dissenting opinion in Locke from 1947 has kind of worked its way into more majority opinions in a modern sense. So I want the students to be able to make sure you're checking out that case in addition to Wisconsin v. or is it Yoder v. Wisconsin or Wisconsin v. Yoder?
I think it's Wisconsin Yoder.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and again, but I mean, again, you're right, Mike and Chris. There's a through line there, and it's not technically a precedent for what's been happening recently. But to make sure the students do understand there is this thing out there that I think starts the ball rolling a little bit there. So, Tim, to kind of go a little bit more of a cultural direction, because I think there's a strong link culturally and what's been happening legally in the more modern era. And it's not that it's necessarily new. I just think it's louder and people are more aware of it. And that is in numerous Christian communities. And I live what I would call on the belt of the Bible community in California. Here in Kern County, and I hear this an awful lot in mainstream and non-denominational communities. There's a common belief that has emerged that the United States government and some states' government and society at large have become hostile to their faith community. And that's reflected in the laws, that's reflected in the Supreme Court decisions of the second half of the 20th century. And I'm just wondering, as a person whose life and feet have been firmly planted in a faith community, how do you explain this phenomenon? And I'm sure you've heard it as well. How do you explain it? And do you agree to some point on the spectrum that a secular political government legal society has been?
All you crazy secular humanists are running roughshod over us, over the righteous. Thanks for this question, Dave.
It's very common, and again,
I know. I think there's number one. I think a lot of evangelicals believe this theory. It kind of starts with Ed Meese back in the 80s that America was founded as a Christian nation. I think this belief is central to this, evangelicals getting all worked up into a lather because, America was Christian at the founding, and it sure as heck looks like it's Sodom and Gomorrah now. So I think a lot of the noise that comes from communities of faith the background assumption is America was Christian, and it certainly doesn't look like it is now. So I think that belief is central. And that's more like I think that's I appreciate the fact you started this out here. Now let's go to cultural stuff. Uh, I think there's also within the Christian tradition this notion of um, there's this principle of the remnant, the faithful remnant. You look at the Old Testament, and the Jewish people were taken into captivity, and Yahweh promises there'll be a faithful remnant that will return to Jerusalem, and I think Christians have kind of picked up on that, and I think in the first couple centuries after Christ there was a lot of persecution.
That's the tagline I hear in my
Yeah, and
community.
so I think the remnant belief is a powerful idea in play, and this persecution. And I think which is kind of paradoxical, that there's this persecution complex. I mean, there was real persecution in the first 2 centuries. Ask any Christian that was torched on the way on the streets on the Appian Way. So I think there's a bad, in my estimation, a bad view of the founding that plays into this resentment and persecution. And I think there's a long tradition of persecution being virtuous. If you endure this persecution, you're virtuous. And the remnant, I think those three things play into this resentment. And frankly, there's a lot, I think. Well, I'll leave it at that. I don't want to get
Well,
way deep here.
well, and I do think that the cultural and the legal join together, that it is the cultural experience, whether legitimate or not, that leads to organizing, putting together private agencies, lobbying groups, think
Yeah.
tanks, law schools, all right,
Yeah.
to begin taking back America to its rightful roots. We look at all of these modern cases, Chris, and I know you're familiar with, they come out of think tanks and certain legal bodies. All right. They're not just individuals, and to be honest, I mean, and to be true to everybody, most of these cases are, there are certain organizations out there looking for a case. But these have been driven by, I think, 50 years of trying to come up and hopefully getting a court who has members on it that will be friendly to these arguments, given that the Earl Warren, Berger, and to a certain degree Rehnquist courts weren't quite as warm to these arguments than as the Roberts court has become. Chris.
I think it's the legal driving the cultural. I think because when you
Oh,
start, yeah, I do, because I think when you start to get with the incorporation, right, of these establishment clause cases that we see, maybe starting as early as actually earlier than the Everson case I mentioned. So because it's become a more pluralistic society, and we've started to recognize that pluralism, so when we incorporate those establishment clause cases to apply to the states, because they have been rolling that way for a long period of time, since prior to the Constitution, states have been rolling that way, and now it's like, well, we got other people in the state that aren't necessarily worshiping your way, and we got to take into consideration. And so you have legal decisions that are driving this backlash of this cultural persecution that Tim is mentioning. So I put in our resources, Justice Alito, when he's being recorded at a dinner that he doesn't know he's being recorded, and he's saying that, yeah, that the persecution against Christians is evident, and that one side is going to win over the other. I think it's in a backlash to the cases, Dave, that you mentioned, of the different justices and the different courts.
I think
I
Chris brings up a great point about the legal driving the cultural. I think the one case that stands out to me, to Chris's point that the legal's driving the cultural, is Engel Vital. You talk to there's a lot of evangelicals who don't know anything about case law, but they know Engel Vital. that case where supposedly, prayer was, kicked out of the public schools. So I think there's something to that, Chris's view that the legal is driving this
Just
culture.
remember that's teacher-led prayer, right? Teacher-led prayer.
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying. Don't shoot the messenger here. I'm just
I know.
saying that a lot of evangelicals know Ingo Vital. Whether they know it well or not is a different issue.
Mike?
Yeah, and Ingo Valtel was 62, right?
Right.
Early 60s, yeah.
Let me make this. This is a half-formed thought on this. But let me make an argument about the political driving.
Why apologize, Mike?
I mean, I've been doing. I think I'll make this work. Okay, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the changes, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and then the Immigration Act in the 60s, and how important that was. That's like a new founding, right? But then I've been thinking through almost immediately, there seems like there's this counter revolution that occurs, and it's happening in different ways in different spots. But Goldwater got crushed in 64. But Goldwater had a certain message about liberty and a certain way to talk about America's values that I think at the time, a lot of, how do I say this in a way, Tim, that's not going to, I want to be nuanced about this. There's this rise of Christian communities seeing that if they're not getting involved in the political system might just do too much to overturn the way they want to be living their lives. And I think you see the upheaval of the civil rights in the 1960s. You have Roe v. Wade in 1973. And then you get, by the time Mies is talking about this,
Yeah.
to me, it's a combination of political power shifted dramatically in the 1960s. And there was an immediate sort of like pushback against that, which is super common. It's what we saw after the Civil War as well, obviously, so there's something going on there that is this combination of the political and the cultural and the legal, that we're in this moment now. And now to Chris's point, we are demographically a completely different looking country than we were in the 1960s. And I think for a lot of communities, I think it's scary. It's too unstable. It doesn't feel like this is the America that they were told we had. And whether that's based in religion, race, or whatever, I think that's a real feeling that's being tapped into now by a lot of different groups. So
Yeah.
Well, see, and that's where and Chris, I'll get to you in a second, but that whole chicken egg, is it culture law or law culture? See, I think it's culture. They're feeling that, but then you have some insightful people, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, who take that religious culture and see a political battle that can enhance their standing, their church's standing in the larger American culture. So you get the moral majority. All right. And I forgot, what's Pat Robertson's organization called? Ralph Reed leads it.
The 700 Club.
No, that's gosh, I forget anyway, but you get these, so that's why I think it's cultural than legal, because they start forming these organizations to now go out and legally advocate. A lot of money comes from these churches and guys like Falwell and Pat Robertson.
it's the moral majority. Was that Pat Robertson?
That was
No, that was Falwell. That was Falwell.
Robertson. Ralph Reed was, and I'm gonna, 2:00 this morning I'll wake up.
Okay.
Ralph Reed is appointed by Pat Robertson,
Yeah.
and Ralph Reed's still around.
It's the
Yep.
there's something to do with family, I think. Something.
Focus on Family is Dobson.
Okay. I remember.
I mean, again, we're talking about, there's a lot of different organizations in the 70s and 80s that pop up, and they bring in a lot of money, and they start forming these legal entities to go out and fight the fights in the courts and in the political arena.
But I think those are forming because of what they see happening on the legal sense. And what I wanted to jump in, Mike touched on, I think you see people that traditionally have in positions of power, especially at the state level, dealing with religion, and you start to see that power being eroded because we are becoming a much more diverse and multicultural community. And we saw this, when Obama ran in 2008, and people are saying, "Well, I want to take back our country." From whom? A democratically elected person? So there's this fear of the other that we know is throughout American history, right? Throughout American history. And I think it goes along with the idea of people that have been in positions of power, which would be predominantly, white people at the state level, white Christian people at the state level. And then as you start to see these legal decisions being made, somewhat chipping away at this power base, there and you see the rise of the moral majorities of the world. But I think we see it today in our debates in the election, right? When you want to otherize people because you use that fear to promote your power.
Well, yeah, it's by the way, it's the Christian Coalition with Pat Robertson and Ralph Reed. And I was wondering, Tim, do you find it fascinating, given that both of us love the history of Christianity and of religion in we like to study it, but don't you find it interesting that one of the byproducts of, I guess, this persecution element and what's been happening the last 50 years is the breakdown of the walls between Protestantism, intra-Protestantism, and Protestants and Catholics. They all seem to be kind of on the same page these days, which defies so much of the history of those things. I just find it
Well,
fascinating.
yeah, it is. It is, given America's suspicions about Catholicism. But I think, I mean, again, I think I thank you, Chris, for interrupting my sleep tonight. This Chris's point about does the culture drive the legal or does the legal drive the culture? I think on the Catholic and Protestant alliance, that's all about Roe. That's all about Roe. And I mean,
and then the offshoots of gay rights and things like that.
oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of evangelicals that know Engel Vital, they know Roe, and they know Lawrence. So I think the cultural reaction is I might be siding with Chris on this that it's a legally driven thing, which
Yeah.
this is terrible this year that I'm agreeing so much with Chris. I don't know
Teachers,
what
this has nothing to do with religion and law. This is all about the fact that the Dodgers are going to the World Series and they all resent me here.
Wait,
So
End
I kind
times.
of,
It's the end times. It's the end times.
I kind of forgot we were still recording. We're still recording, right? Okay. So focus.
Professor Kavanaugh, I came across an article by a professor from Vanderbilt Law School, and also Justice Sotomayor and her dissent in the Kennedy or Bremerton case kind of alludes to it too. And Professor Shaw argued that the current, not just the Bremerton, but a series of cases, the 303 case, the cake maker case, that these decisions have led pretty much to the death of the Establishment Clause. That the majority of this court views it, as Tim had said, very narrowly. It just means you can't have a national religion, but all other things are fair and open for governments to do. Do you agree with that?
I think,
it's dead?
yeah, I think if you're looking at current case law, and I think Professor Shaw also mentions Carson versus Macon, the case out of Maine. I think that's his main jumping off points in the article. I put a link to the article in the show notes as well for the students because he mentions several cases. It's obviously a very well written piece. So yeah, I do see a trend with the current court moving there. I guess if we're talking in a binary sense, and we have two clauses, and we have an establishment clause and a free exercise clause, I see the current court certainly favoring free exercise much more at the expense of what people would say is the establishment clause. And they're coupling that too. I think it's interesting. They're coupling that with also First Amendment free speech claims as well.
Yeah.
And there are numerous cases, and I know Sotomayor in her dissent, they talk about, they do mention play in the joints, which is actually for students, it's not necessary. Rehnquist stole that, by the way, in the Locke case. He got that from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. So if you want to go into legitimate history, look up Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and the play in the joints and the laws. And then Rehnquist works that into his decision in Locke. But yeah, I think that clearly, I mean, just looking at the Bremerton case, very much favoring establishment over, or excuse me, favoring free exercise over establishment. just even in that case, it's kind of remarkable in a way if you look at the facts of the case, because I'm not sure in the facts of Bremerton as put out by the majority, they even have their facts correct in some of the things that they write in their decision, which is a little troubling to me because it's almost like it's almost like they're shading things a little bit because they're only talking about these 3 times that this coach he came out to the 50-yard line to pray, but he had been doing it for 7 years, right? He had been doing it for 7 years. And the one reason there was a melee is because, not a melee, but there was a scene, is because he had alerted the media and the media was there to cover that. And I wanted to put a clip in our notes about the Cal football team and knocking down the Stanford band guy because there was an episode of the media and all these fans rushing the field to go pray with the coach that members of the band were knocked over. So I thought that would be kind of funny to put that in there. So yes, the court is definitely leaning towards free exercise at the expense of establishment. I mean, I think that's clear in a number of cases.
So I've often thought, I read the Bremerton case too, and I've often asked my fellow believers, I guess is the word. So if you're all jazzed up about praying, there's this verse in the New Testament where Jesus himself says, maybe you ought to go in your closet. Maybe you're not, this public, in the New Testament, he goes after the religious leadership as hypocrites quite a bit, and these Pharisees, they love to pray on the corner and they're real loud and showy. And, he's challenging that maybe the simple act of prayer in your own prayer closet by yourself is just as important. So I don't know this man in Bremerton. I don't know his heart, but I do wonder about, the 50-yard line.
Well, from what I understand is he's making a lot more money on the speakers circuit than he did as a coach.
And and if that's true, he ought to give it all away.
My curiosity is if you were to go out to the 50-yard line and throw down a prayer rug and face Mecca to offer up prayers to Allah, would the court have supported that? Because
it wouldn't have taken 7 years.
Well, that's the thing. It's like the school in the Bremerton School District, they're just trying to protect themselves from possible lawsuits based upon the Lemon test, and basically Gorsuch says that the court has abandoned the Lemon test and all 3 prongs of it. So you have school administrations like, oh golly, we got this. We just found out that this guy's been doing this for a while, and people have been going out there with him. The lights are still on. He's got his uniform. He's got his his coaching outfit on. It's just, are we opening ourselves up to a lawsuit here for a violation of the Establishment Clause? And so we asked him to stop doing it, and he continued to do it. And then and the court said he was fired. He was not fired. This is another place where they shaded the truth. He was put on paid administrative leave. So I don't know why the court felt the need to not deal with the actual facts. I did find it interesting in Sotomayor's dissent. She actually includes a photo, and it's not often that you see photos in Supreme Court opinions. As a matter of fact, that's like the only one I can think of. And she shows the coach surrounded by these athletes taking a knee, and he's holding up 2 football helmets, giving his prayer. And so it's, is that in his free time? Or is he a school employee at this point? There's some interesting things.
Well, I know if I ever get a chance to meet St. Peter, I want to know if he's a Packers fan. That's what I'm wondering here.
Of course he is.
So Professor Williams, it kind of sucks for you because of what you focus your graduate studies on, but you are our comparative internationalist here, and so it's just standard because this comes out of my curiosity. because I was such an Americanist and so provincial in my view of the world that finally I've grown out of, but I got a lot of learning to do. Is this a uniquely American conflict, conversation, legal issue, or around the world, do they have the same kind of issues constitutionally, legally, not so much culturally, but that thing? What insights do you have?
Yeah, I would say that when you think about Europe, Canada, Australia, like let's think about those places maybe. There is a tension. I mean, there is a tension between religious freedom and establishment. So far, and I'll preface this by saying so far, because I think for students, this is an interesting thing to keep your eye on as politics change in Europe and other places. But generally speaking, courts have been much more likely to lean into the state needs to be neutral, the state needs to be secular, right? So that's definitely the case in France. France passed numerous laws in the 2010s on religious clothing, public displays of religion, and they promoted it based on, well, look, we are promoting a secular society, and we don't want to privilege any one religion. That's caused some backlash, especially with the Muslim community, but that's what the law has been. The European Union as well. There was a couple cases there where different states tried to enact laws that curtailed religious clothing, and the court said it was fine. One court said it was to promote, quote, living together. They wanted people the state should not be privileging or allowing different groups to do that. So it seems like as of right now, they're kind of where maybe the United States was, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that what we've been discussing, it's a moving target, and things have changed a lot because courts, judges, and justices are not immune from the political system and not immune from political culture. And I think as it's going to be interesting to watch and see as these sort of Europe has their own sort of MAGA sort of philosophies going on in different places in Europe. And it's going to be interesting to see what the consequences of that are in the next 15 to 20 years and if things change.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, Chris.
What Mike talking about, it makes me, I had this written down, a quote from Gorsuch in Bremerton. He said that learning how to tolerate speech or prayer of all kinds is part of learning how to live in a pluralistic society, a trait of character essential to a tolerant citizenry. So I thought that was interesting that he uses that type of language. And I think it's also important, and this goes along with some of our other programs on judicial interpretation. This opinion came out in Bremerton the same time that Dobbs and Bruin came out. And so they're using this text and history tradition in its interpretation, which is to me kind of troubling because if you go back to the colonial era, it took 130 years to talk about public. We 130 years before we started a public school system. Mm-hmm. And at what point in time can we go back and look at the tradition of high school football coaches giving speeches or prayers? How far back do we want to go? Because I want to throw out Mary Dwyer, who in 1660 was hanged in Massachusetts for professing her Quaker beliefs. So how far back do we want to go and to teach a tolerant citizenry? And I think that this is interesting to think about. I wrote this down, so bear with me. The government, whether it be federal government, state, or municipal governments, are just a patchwork of institutions, each of them comprised of individuals. If you allow for every individual within these institutions to engage in public endorsements of religion, you're effectively showing that the institutions themselves can do that.
So, gentlemen, we've come to the end of our discussion, and so it's now.
Tim wants to rebut. He needs to rebut.
No, I was with you on the first sentence. I don't know that it's automatically binding. It's an institutional endorsement. I think there's enough. I mean, culturally, we're so jaded. I don't know that we automatically equal position of leadership with institution. I think we're a little more jaded to not make that jump. Now, I'm also willing to concede that I think in some cases you are right, that it is maybe in some context an institutional endorsement, but I don't know about a carte blanche there. Yeah, that's all I see it a little more nuanced than that, I guess.
All right, final thoughts and recommendations to students and teachers as they prepare for this Unit 5 question. Professor Williams?
Yeah, let me start with this. I think the way we talked about the First Amendment as at least as applied to the national government, it's a pretty clear statement of small L liberalism, meaning the government shouldn't have a role to play on telling individuals what their moral values should be. You play within the law, and it's up to you. That's one of the tenets of small L liberalism. And after listening to this conversation, I know it didn't come up, so maybe this isn't fair, but there is this interesting pushback right now, and I'll put some stuff in the show notes. This kind of post-liberal notion, this idea that we've let people have too much agency, and maybe it's time for the government to give us a vision of civic virtue. If we're going to put it in the language of civic virtue, there's a content to that, and maybe that content should be religious based, right? And I think that for me is like it's the undercurrent of this debate. It's this kind of feeling. I really think it's after the Cold War ended when we didn't have to pretend to the rest of the world what we were saying. We could just have some battles that we've been having from the beginning in this country over these issues. And I think that there's a group of folks in the United States, a growing number, who are saying, we as a society, we lack virtue, we lack values, and it's if the government wants to step in my community, and if my school wants to do something, or my court wants to display whatever, I'm okay with that. Now they're okay with it because it's aligned with their value prescription, and maybe it's aligned with the majority in their community. I get that, but it's just this interesting kind of notion of like, how the Republican Party is the one who's really leaning into it's okay for the government to, I don't know, insert morals and values into our lives, when that was not what small L liberalism was all about for the Republican Party for the longest time. So I hope that made sense. That's kind of my take.
Professor Moore?
Yeah,
I believe you have a book.
I do, but my first thought is this is shameless self-promotion, but I think really kind of explore the three views of establishment that are laid out in the We the People text. I think it would be helpful in making all your discussions, oh, well, you're coming from that viewpoint, or you're coming from this, from a strict separation, or you're non-preferential. So I think though that framework might help your discussions, and it might help you make those, answer in follow-ups some of the questions that you might be getting. And I think teachers, every teacher should have this book, Sacred Rights of Conscience. It's a collection of documents, primary source materials from colonial and the founding period. The editors are Dreisbach and Hall. It is a fantastic book. Just documents galore on all kinds of topics related to religious freedom and religious liberty. It's really a wonderful book of primary source material, one-stop shop.
Professor Kavanaugh?
Ditto on the book. I definitely have. I think I have two copies, one of them courtesy of Professor Moore. Also, I have two sources that I've got on our source page. One is meant to be kind of funny. It is a YouTube video of a Snickers commercial from a few years back, featuring the Washington Commanders back when they had a different name, and they were bringing in all these different religious leaders, faith leaders for prayer, and it was not going anywhere for a while. Enjoy a Snickers. So they had a traditional clergy coming through, then followed by a shaman and a different few ways. Just that's for students, if you encounter that, that's just me being silly. But there's also I included a concurrence opinion from Justice Boson from the New Mexico State Supreme Court back in 2013. It's in the Elaine photography case. It was very similar to the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, because New Mexico had expanded their civil rights protection to the LGBTQ community. It's a short opinion. It's got some cases in there that I know that you guys will be talking about in this class, about when you hang your shingle up in public to do business in public, right? So hanging your shingle up means I'm open for business, whether I'm baking cakes or whether I'm, taking photographs. I would encourage you to read that, because I think he lays out some simple and very astute arguments, again, using cases that you guys will be familiar with, or hopefully you're familiar with. This is a tough topic, as you can see, the idea of the establishment and free exercise clauses. So understand this is, this could start a fight in an empty bar in some places when you start talking about this. I would reiterate what Tim said, in terms of what's in the textbook and how to, what type of, separatist, so to speak, are you? How separate do you want it to be? And just remember, we are a much more diverse community than we were in 1791, and we're going to continue to become more diverse. So don't just think about where we are right now. Where are we going to be in 50 years, and what should the law be in 50 years? So think long-term as well.
So if I were going to judge students on this, one of the pathways I'd go down has kind of been touched on here, but also Mike kind of dealt with it. But culturally, what role do you think, or should religion play in civic culture, in political culture? And is it part of our civic virtue? That is, in order to be virtuous, we need to have active religious institutions and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of different angles to go at, but that's something I think you need to think about there, because that has. I mean, there's no doubt that in the original 18th century that, yeah, there was a firm belief, even by Madison and Jefferson, that personal religious conviction did, in fact, play a role in the notion of virtue there, kind of stuff. But we are, as has been mentioned, far more diverse, and the world is very much a different place there. But be aware of that cultural side. So hopefully that has helped you with your work and your discussions that you will have in our next session. You might want to let your Unit 2 compadres know that we'll be talking about the Articles of Confederation. So until then, peace, love. Yes, Professor Moore is getting all hot and bothered here. Peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye, bye-byes.